Okay, so this is the story of Ampleforth, a small program whose sole ambition in life was to become a live literate editor for the Newspeak programming language. And it's finally on the verge of achieving that, and it turns out that that means that it can be a lot more than that. It can basically be anything it wants to be when it grows up. So what do I mean by that? Well, that's what this talk is about. Ampleforth started out as a very simple tool that would let you do things like this. It would let you put little evaluators for Newspeak code that were live inside a web page. But even then, it was a bit precocious because the results were links. And so if you followed the links, you might get an object inspector on the result, and that would let you see the class of that particular object and things like that. So that was useful. And the next step was basically to make it easier to put these widgets directly into a web page. And a few years ago, I wrote a blog post that explained how Ampleforth worked at that point in time, and it discusses itself and shows the Ampleforth class, and you can look at the methods and you can change them, and you do all the sort of small talky things that Newspeak knows how to do. But there was a real flaw in that, and the flaw was that Ampleforth wasn't compositional. What do I mean by that? Ampleforth would let you put live Newspeak widgets inside a document, but it would not let you put a document inside Newspeak widget. And if you actually complete that loop and let it work both ways, then you can nest documents inside widgets, inside documents ad infinitum to any depth you want, and you start to have some real flexibility. For example, you can do things like the help option here inside this widget, which if you click, shows you a help text for this slide presenter that I've written. And inside it are these live widgets like this menu, and it actually operates just like the menu in the widget itself. And it's useful to look at that because we'll find that in the class here that is presenting what that particular option in the menu does is show you the presenter, the view for the thing that you're looking at, and it defines its help text. And that help text is right here, is again given by HTML, and there's a method call that makes it do its thing. And if we evaluate it, we'll see that we get, well, we don't. Of course, it's a demo. I probably didn't click the right thing. If we evaluate it again, then we get this Ampleforth fragment, which is basically the thing that is showing us the live help. And to show that that's true, we can go and edit this, say, by putting in some random text, right, like blah, blah, and accept that, and go back to where we were. And if we look at the help again, indeed, it says blah, blah. So that's just something useful because we combine the liveness of a sort of Smalltalk system with this idea that we should be able to nest our documents and editors within each other. But there's still something missing in Ampleforth, which was, of course, that it wasn't an editor at that stage. It was just a tool that would go over an HTML page and swap out pieces of the DOM. But now it is an editor. And the way it works is fairly standard. It's a trick that many people use for these kind of things. If we look here, the source of this is actually HTML markup. So in fact, Ampleforth is a two-view editor that has both a WYSIWYG view that we've been watching for these slides until now, and a markup view that is showing us the HTML. And the HTML is the model for the editor, so it's the source of truth. So if I edit this HTML here where it says editing, and I type that, right, it does its thing, and vice versa, right? If I go ahead and say something here, then you can see that it's also affecting markup over there, right? So that's not rocket science either, but I find it's a really useful design for these kind of editors, and we'll discuss that a bit further as we go along. But of course, it's still a literate editor, so it lets us do things like put live widgets inside our slides and things like that. And that's similar to what's done with a sort of paper that was a submission for the workshop here. It's essentially the same counter, It's a live counter. We can increment and decrement and that sort of thing. And the interesting thing, because we want to do live programming, is of course that we can have the definition for this counter embedded in the slide as well. This is a method presenter which shows individual methods, and we can look at the code and say that there's a definition here of a button that increments and a button that decrements and so forth. And let's say we think that increment isn't a good name because it actually conveys something, and we're real programmers and we like obscure names that nobody can understand. And so we can change that. And as you see, the actual counter has changed, but it's still preserved its state and it's still live and does its thing, right? So this is kind of what we expected from live literate programming in using Newspeak. But it turns out that that leads us to something richer, because once we can do that, we can do a thing that I'm terming docucentric programming. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's say that we want to build a counter here in the document from scratch. So we type in what we had there. We had a display of the counter value. Then we had an increment button. And we had a decrement. And we had a reset. And we have this interactive feature which allows us, it's called Make It an Amplet. An amplet is basically a piece of live Newspeak code inside a document, inside an Ampleforth document. And if we select these and make them amplets, then we start getting our counter, and it already works. And we can put it back. And the way it works is, again, it's if we look at the HTML, there are these little pieces of HTML here, which are of class Ampleforth. So this is kind of what we want to see. And the class is a way for indicating which parts of the DOM the program should be interested in. And what it does, it goes, finds these and swaps them out for a widget. And how does it know which widget to use? Well, that's the name property. And the name property was taken from the text that we typed into the document, right? And that name property identifies a widget because it's basically the name of a method that should return us a widget. We get that widget back and insert it into the live DOM. So where do these methods come from? Well, the document is really an object. Those who know me know that I'm very much a hardcore Smalltalk kind of object-oriented guy. And we can look at the document object right here and inspect it. And we get a Newspeak inspector. It's still showing us the rendering of the document, but now we have the other paraphernalia of an object inspector. And we can view, the basic view shows us here, there's a bunch of instance variables that this object has. But the important part is that we actually can look at the class of the object. And here they are, the things we typed in: counter value, increment, decrement, and so forth. So increment, for example, is a method that returns a button. And we can evaluate it and see that we get a button fragment, which is a widget representing a button. Now, the nice thing about this is that it's a very simple way of doing this, right? The counter's right here as an instance variable. There's none of the fancy model view controller separation that we might get in a more traditional setup. In fact, if we do go back to the slide with the counter and look at that document, we can see that it had a method for the counter, which it's showing in the counter definition. And the counter, in fact, returns us a counter presenter, which is sort of a view object. That version of the counter was done to illustrate how the UI framework works. And so it's overkill for a counter, but it shows you the whole model view separation. If we look at counter definition, it goes to some work to produce a method browser, but the heart of it is it's asking for the class counter UI, where it will look for this method. And when we look at that, we can go look at counter UI and see that it includes a counter presenter, that is a view, and a counter subject, which is what you'd call a controller. And the counter here, capital counter, is in fact a little wrapper for an integer value because it's a model. And all this paraphernalia is not something that an ordinary human should want to know about. It's very useful if you're building a complicated UI to have these principal separations, but it isn't actually something that ordinary people should do. So there's sort of a smoother curve here into programming. Another nice property of this thing is, let's say I didn't like the fact it was laid out as a row. Here I just edit it, right? I can go here and edit this thing. What happened here? That actually is suspicious. Oh, yeah. I don't know what happened there, but expect bugs. This is all very new. And so now we still have this working counter, but now it's laid out differently. And we laid it out by editing, basically, in a document. We don't actually have to go and touch a program. So all of these properties make things easier. This is what I mean by open during construction, right? We're actually editing the GUI and building it while it's still live and working, and it works when it's partially constructed, when we only had the increment button and not the other buttons. And so, of course, if we wanted a more structured version, we can evolve from that. There's nothing preventing us from taking that code and starting to separate it into views and controllers and things like that. So this is the basic idea here, is that once you have a literate program editor that actually works the way you'd expect a live literate program editor to work, you essentially do have a GUI builder, because all that means is you now have a document where you didn't type in the text, and you just have the live widgets, which you can construct this way by inserting them. And so the GUI is the GUI builder in the same sense as, say, Smalltalk Morphic is, because it's non-modal. It continues to operate while you construct it. At the same time, it's a general purpose editor, and you can start out with something simple like writing tweets or SMSs and inserting images or videos and things. And later, maybe you have some palette of useful buttons. And eventually you get to the point where you know how to add new buttons, and this links into the full IDE. You could do a computational notebook. That's a side project that I want to do, which shouldn't take very long, actually, once you have all the rest of this infrastructure. But basically, it's a continuum from writing SMSs and tweets to IDEs, the full sort of story that we do in a live Smalltalk-style IDE. So what are the principles that make this work? The principles I think are important for the design of this editor. So the first thing I've mentioned already is that the markup is the model. And having markup as a model is advantageous because it's a language and it composes, it has semantics, and people can read it, and we can manipulate it easily and search it and do various kind of meta programming around it. We can generate new such programs, so we can basically manage the editor's model computationally in a much easier way. It also has a very pragmatic advantage here. I've built this UI, which is very rudimentary, but all the things that you might want to do that the UI doesn't have affordances for, you can do, because the markup is HTML, and you can go and do it in the markup view that's here on the side very easily. The other, of course, important principles are that it does have to be a full hypermedia editor, right? We can't just have rich text or just images or whatever. We have to have arbitrary computation so we can build arbitrary applications, which was the goal with the live literate programming in the first place. Then we, of course, want to be able to script this, and we want to script it in a fully reflective general purpose programming language, so we can write the logic for the different new things that we construct. And we want it to be fully reflective so that we can change things and see the results on the fly. Like when we actually change the definition for the counter in a previous slide, it immediately took effect, right? We want that liveness, and we want a language that sort of guarantees those effects. When you change the program, things respond immediately without restarting and so forth. And of course, the markup has to be available to be manipulated from that language, so we have to reify it in some form into the language. And last but not least, we want it to be self-hosting, because we want this entire editor not only so that we can script applications in it, but if we want to change its behavior and extend its own fundamental behavior, we should be able to do it using that same language in itself. And that is the case here because, of course, Ampleforth is written in Newspeak. So that's really all I had to tell you. And I figured I'd leave some room for discussion or questions if there are any. And there are a few ideas here. You'll see that all this relates to several of the previous talks, I suppose not entirely coincidentally, that these ideas are in the air. Yoshiki talked about the metaverse and how if you use versions of HTML that that allow you to model 3D, then you can manipulate that markup and try and get something as impressive as what Yoshiki showed us. Obviously, using a document relates to the very first talk that Jeffrey had. And I think everybody's talking about ChatGPT and so forth, and how we figure that in is also an interesting topic. So thank you for listening, and that's all I had.
Thank you. Yes.
So are there any questions?
Yes.
Hey, Gilad, it's Peter. So I'm going to channel my inner Jonathan Edwards since I don't see him here and ask a cranky question. I have now tried several times to produce Ampleforth. I've gone and poked around a few times now, and I find it very difficult to build a mental model in, despite the claims that it's so simple. And I was trying to reflect on why that is, and I think I had a bit of an insight watching you work, which was that there's just a lot of things that I don't need to touch, but I don't know this. And one of the weirdly sort of paradoxically nice things about the terrible, complicated monstrosity that is React is that when I'm editing a React component, everything I need, the whole behavior of that system, everything I need to understand is actually on screen, or at least in a single text buffer. And I wondered if there was any way that you could bring some of those everything you need and nothing that you don't kind of properties to like a Newspeak editing environment, so that people like me without as much knowledge of the system or experience with Smalltalks could be more successful.
So first of all, I want to clarify. You mean you've actually tried whatever version of the system is out there and played with it, and that's
I
the
went and
basis
poked
for
around on the website. Yeah, and I was trying to figure out how Ampleforth worked, and I just couldn't figure out what to click on or where to find what was happening. Like I kept clicking into things, and then I'd be in places, and I'd be like, I feel like I'm in a broom closet. I need to go back, and I'd click around for a while, and then just kind of get lost and give up before I got to the meat because I didn't know where to go.
Well, thanks for trying. Of course, perhaps unsuccessfully. Part of it is layout, right? And there are experiments here that one could try, right? So, for example, I've tried to make stuff go away as much as possible, like these.
So we can't see your screen at the moment.
Oh, has it? Have they turned that off? Okay. Well, I don't know if I should put it back on. I guess I'll put it back on. And then we can quickly. So, right, there are these things that I make disappear, right? Like these menus and the HTML view. And arguably, in certain situations, or if you go to the document view, in fact, you have even more things that you may or may not want to see, right? You have an editor, and now you have a class, and there's only so. Actually, my tendency has been to make as much of these things go away by default and only show if you want them. But maybe I'm wrong. Obviously, we can put the widgets that show all the code in here. I don't know. It didn't seem to me as a good idea, but you really need more experience. When other people use the system, you're always surprised by what they do or what they don't do. I will note that, as I showed, there is actually a lot of help in the system. Maybe it's not good enough, but there's sort of like explanations around almost every widget, what it does and so forth. But I don't know. I think part of it it's these models are different than the conventional editors, and people, maybe familiarity is important. I don't really have a good answer for you, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's about 45 clickable buttons on the screen right now, by my estimate. And I think I know what B, I, and U would do. I assume that's bold, italic, and underline. But all the rest are mysterious to me. And triple dots imply further. I will happily come and bumble through and make a fool of myself for you on a screen share sometime, if that would be useful.
I'd love to do that. So of course, all these buttons are actually explained and live with text if you know the one question mark button. But I'm not claiming that I'm necessarily a great UI designer, and so it's entirely possible that we could improve this radically. But its basic problem is it is very different than the mainstream, and I think that's simply a disadvantage that is inherent in not having won the game early on.
Perhaps. Well, I appreciate you engaging seriously with my cranky question all the same.
No, not at all. And I'd love to talk one-on-one and see what we can do to improve this. So is that it? Anyone else? Or am I standing between you and dinner?
We have one more question. Time for one more.
Yeah, you are standing between us and dinner, Gilad. But thanks for a good talk. James, over here. My question is, you've got the markup in the two-view editor, but you must be doing more sophisticated stuff than effectively simply rebuilding the UI from the description, because you're maintaining all that live state, even though you're re-editing the HTML. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. Part of it, I am leaning quite heavily on the fact that the DAM HTML is wicked fast and can re-render things. But some of these widgets they're using the Newspeak UI, which is itself a reactive UI, buggy though it may be. And so it is doing the classic kind of thing of trying to keep things up to date as things change underfoot. So between those two things, it mostly works, and when it doesn't, I have to go fix some problem somewhere.
Okay, one more hand for Gilad, our last speaker.